Turi, hello. Thank you so much for joining me. I know you've been really, really busy, so thank you for taking some time out to have a chat with me.
No problem.
Brilliant. So Turi, to start off with, I've been doing a bit of Googling, and please excuse me, but what you do is incredibly complicated. Can you explain to me exactly who you are and what you do?
Yes. Okay. I'm from Canada, and I went to Cambridge and did an undergraduate in archaeology and anthropology. And it was while I was there that I got really interested in how you can use genetics to kind of answer questions in archaeology, history, this kind of thing. I thought, well, I better get a molecular genetics degree under my belt. So I went to Leicester and I learned molecular genetics. I did a master's and then a PhD and a postdoc. And basically, I now work using both modern DNA and ancient DNA to sort of answer questions in history and archaeology. So that's what I do.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's cleared it up for me. Thank you. And of course, you are most famous for the work that you did on Richard III.
Yes.
Can you talk us through that because it's fascinating?
Yeah. I was the first person brought onto the project by Richard Buckley, who was the co-director of the University of Leicester Archaeological Services. So way back in 2011, he had a phone call from a lady called Philippa Langley, who was the secretary of the Scottish branch of the Richard III Society at the time. And the idea was to see if we could look for the remains of King Richard III. Now, we know from historical documentation that he was killed at the Battle of Bosworth, and then he was brought back to Leicester, and he was buried in the choir of the Church of the Greyfriars in Leicester. Now, since then, you've got the dissolution of the monasteries, and the friary's been torn down, and it's now covered by a car park and buildings. So the area where the friary used to be, or the friary precinct, that's never been lost. There's names like Friar Lane for a start, things like this, and Greyfriars. So we knew kind of the general area where it was going to be, but the precise location of the friary has been lost. It could have been tucked under buildings, could be under the car park. We basically don't know. So what happened was the Richard III Society put in money, the University of Leicester put in money to do the excavation, and the City Council helped as well. And the idea was to do sort of a 2-week recce dig. Let's see if we can just find the friary first. And then maybe next year, if we can work out where we are, we can kind of hone in, because we know that Richard's in the choir of the Church of the Greyfriars. So this was basically what we were going to do. And I was brought in to kind of help lead with sort of excavating under clean conditions, because one of the things you're really worried about is contaminating the sample, the DNA, any skeletons we might find with our own DNA. And I can talk about that a little bit later on when we come to the analysis bit. But then also to kind of lead the genetic analysis. So we start excavating and thinking, I was told, don't worry, we're never going to find Richard III. But I mean, Richard Buckley's lovely. So he was leading the excavation. He's been working in archaeology. He just retired actually about a week ago. So he's been working in downtown Leicester and working with medieval Leicester for the last sort of 35 years. So his plan was essentially to sort of start excavating. Let's put some long, thin trenches down one of the car parks. Let's just see if we can find any evidence of the friary. 6 hours and 34 minutes in, so the digger's just going in, we come across a little bit of leg bone.
That never
Now,
happens, does it?
well, we thing is we knew this is a friary site, so we could come down on a graveyard. We could come across thousands of skeletons. We don't know, and that's precisely the thing. So we have just started excavating. You cannot just lift sets of remains willy-nilly for excavations. You have to get a license from the Ministry of Justice. So we are not going to excavate the first skeleton that we find, because we might come across thousands of them and we don't know where we are. We could be inside church, we could be outside the church. So what we do, because we want to keep this skeleton as safe as possible in case it turns out to be something interesting. So we keep it covered, we don't excavate it. We cover up the little bit of leg bone and we keep excavating. And after about 2 weeks of this, we realized that skeleton one, this one that we found on the very first day, looks like, from the bits of the friary that we found, it looks like it could be down at one end of the choir. So we think we found what might be part of the choir. The skeleton looks like it could be down at one end of it. So we go back and think, well, we'll make this one of our kind of, we've decided we'll lift up to 6 sets of remains, and we're going to look for ones that look like possible candidates. So youngish male, headed, some sort of battle injuries, because we know that he's died in battle. We know that he might have some sort of spinal abnormality, in that he's been described as a hunchback, famously by Shakespeare, who was actually sort of writing, in the Tudor period. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. But there was one contemporary document which talked about him having one shoulder higher than the other. So he may have some sort of spinal abnormality. So these are the kind of things we're looking for: youngish male, possibly battle injuries, probably some sort of spinal abnormality. Certainly needs to be somewhere probably in the choir of the church type thing. And this skeleton is fitting for location. So we start uncovering it. And I actually miss all this because we started excavating on the 4th of September. And this was Joe Appleby and I. And there was a film crew there that Philippa had brought in. And you know what film crews are like, bless them. They're like, can you do that again? Can you cover that up? Can you do that again? We thought, okay, well, we don't want to uncover the skeleton but not be able to lift it, because we want to protect this as much as possible. Human remains, treat with respect, etc. So we get up to around near his hips, and then we're like, we're not going to get this done today, so let's stop. And the next day I go off to a forensics conference in Innsbruck, and I land in Innsbruck, and I text Joe and I go, how's our 90-year-old friar? Because I'm like, this is never going to be interesting. This is a 90-year-old friar who lived a nice long life and died in his bed. This is not going to be anything exciting. And so she texts back going, youngish male, battling head injuries. I was kind of basically, I was like, oh my goodness. So even at this point, it was looking likely that these were possibly the remains of Richard. So then I fly back and we have to start the analysis. And what you have to do for that is you have to get DNA from the skeleton, and then you have to compare it against a known relative. So we actually had that before the project started. And I suppose the other thing to say is that obviously this kind of threw things off in a completely different tact, because we thought this would be a nice recce excavation. Suddenly it turns into a huge research project, which the university completely funded. All of our time, all of the research, all of the funding, everything that we were doing. So the university suddenly had to go, right, we have to find the money for this, and it's not inexpensive. So what I had to do was I had to see if I could get any DNA from the ancient remains, and then test against a living relative, to see whether or not there was a DNA match. And as I say, so there already was a relative that we knew about.
Okay.
So this was a lovely chap called Michael Ibsen, and he's Canadian like me. He already knew he was related to Richard III because his family tree has actually been published in a number of different sources, down to a certain point. So in the Ruveny Roll, which, so there's a whole chunk of it which was already known. But a chap called John Ashdown Hill and a few of his kind of colleagues managed to trace it down the last sort of 3 or 4 generations to a woman called Joy Ibsen, who was living in Canada. And she sadly died a few years ago, but her son Michael was living in London. And what the importance of his lineage is that he's a female line relative. Okay. Now that's really important because the DNA that we have got is a really complex mixture of our ancestors that's been passed down through the generations, and we actually won't have any DNA from many of our ancestors. But there's 2 pieces of DNA that are passed down through the generations in a really simple way. So so I say there's 2 of these. One of them is mitochondrial DNA. So this is a small circular piece of DNA, and it's in the egg. So us gals, we'll pass it down to all of our children, but boys have sperm, not eggs. Yep. So only daughters pass it down. Oh. So Richard will have got his mitochondrial DNA from his mom, Cecily. He also has an elder sister called Anne, who also will have got her mitochondrial DNA from Cecily. So she happens to have a daughter, who has a daughter, who has a couple of daughters, because there's another person who comes into this. But basically down through the generation, daughter to daughter to daughter, down through the generations, till you get down to Michael, right, who got it from his mom, etc. So what I can do is I can look at his mitochondrial DNA, and it should match the skeleton. Now, the other thing we wanted was, the more the merrier type thing, because if we can, so say there's been anything that's happened in the records for that genealogy and he's not actually descended through a female line, then there wouldn't be a mitochondrial DNA match.
So that's because not everybody's dad is actually their dad, is it?
Yeah, well, so this is actually through the female line. So you tend to know who the mom is. But you're right. We can get onto Y chromosome in a minute, the male line. So, but if there'd been anything going on in that genealogy, so we had a chap called Kevin Schur, who's a professor of English local history, and all of the places where it was published, there was no kind of information about the documentary evidence about why do we think this link is going on. So what he did was he checked the family tree and dug out every single piece of documentary evidence to prove that that tree was correct, and that was really important. And the other thing we wanted to do was we wanted to see if we could find anybody else. Is there anyone else who also comes down through the female line? Because as I say, the more the merrier. You can check mitochondrial DNA types against each other, and then it should match the skeleton. And we found this lovely lady. So this was Kevin Schur and his team found this lovely lady called Wendy Duldig. I love her surname. Duldig. Are you kidding me?
Name for an archaeologist.
Yeah, this is definitely not a dull dig that we were on. So it was great. And she was really sweet. So she also agreed to take part. And I had this lovely thing where I was in Kevin's office and he said, oh, the team, they've come up with this name, Wendy Duldig. So we Googled Wendy Duldig. How do we get a hold of her?
Many Duldigs around.
I know. So we found this number. But it was an old website. And so Kevin was like, oh, she's not likely to be there. And I said, what's the worst that can happen? I'll call her. I'll go grab a coffee. I'll go back to my office. He had to go to a meeting. I'll go back to my office and I will try and ring her. So I rang her up. And I get this lovely lady on the end of the phone, and I have to say, hi, my name's Turi King. I'm from the University of Leicester, and I don't know if you've heard, but we've excavated the remains. We think possibly might be Richard III, and we think that you might be a relative that we could use for DNA testing. And love, bless her. She was like, "Am I on the radio?" I think she thought it was like a scam. So I had to chat to her, and then I chatted her all the way through stuff, and then I got off the phone, and then I rang Kevin. I said, I think you need to, we found her. You need to ring her up and chat to her. And so he rang her up and talked to her all through the family tree, and she had heard some of the names. So she believed us. We weren't completely crazy. And she agreed to take part. So what I did was I looked at their mitochondrial DNA types, because they are 14th cousins twice removed through the female line. Right. I know they connect through a pair of sisters, right, going several hundred years ago. So I'm looking at their mitochondrial DNA types, and that should be the type that I then find in Richard, because they're all related through the female line. And that's what happened. So basically, now the interesting thing with working with ancient DNA is that, whilst we're alive, we've got nice long chromosomes, nice long strands of DNA. And there are things that come along and it breaks the DNA strands, and our body just knits it back together. But after death, that's not happening. So the DNA starts to break down, and it gets into shorter and shorter fragments until there's nothing left that you can actually read. I liken it to kind of like a book. Okay. So eventually all you've got left is like letters, but they're not joined together. Okay. So they get shorter. So you might still have a paragraph, or you might still have, a few words together, but eventually it'll get to the point where there's just letters and you don't know what the book's saying. That's kind of like a DNA sequence. You kind of read it like that. And I didn't know whether or not we'd actually be able to get any usable DNA out of the remains. So because we've got lots of really, really nice long strands of DNA, all you need to do is breathe on the remains, and you put your DNA on there. And if there's any ancient DNA left, it's getting swamped out by any modern DNA that you put on it. So you have to excavate under what's known as clean conditions. Right. So this is the whole face masks and the hairnets and the full CSI suits and the double gloves and everything like that. And you have to work very hard to keep the sample as clean as possible. You sample everyone who was on site and you test their DNA, because you want to make sure that the DNA that you're getting out of the remains is actually from the remains, and not from somebody, me or Joe or anyone else who was on site. And you have to work in clean labs.
Right.
So you have to go work in dedicated facilities to go and do that. We don't actually have any at the University of Leicester. So I had to travel to 2 separate labs to do the work. And one of them, ironically, was up in York. So there was this huge court battle that
Right.
was going on about where the remains of Richard III should be reinterred.
Yes.
And York obviously was, there was a group of people from York who felt that his remains should be reinterred there. So I was actually traveling up and down to York to work in the lab there with little bits of Richard as I went. So he has been back to York.
In pieces, bit by bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. So their whole case was things like they you know, he asked to be buried in York. Well, he didn't leave a will that we know of.
Yeah.
They said his relatives were buried in Yorkshire. That his relatives were buried there, and it's like none of them are buried in Yorkshire. In fact, his whole family actually comes from Fotheringay, so that might have been a possible place. There were sort of various sort of things that you could kind of. There wasn't really it didn't seem like there was a proper case for that one. The normal archaeological practice is nearest consecrated ground. So when we put in the excavation license, it was for the remains to be reinterred in Leicester Cathedral, which you can basically throw a stone at from the excavation site. And that's where Richard has been reinterred. So you mentioned Y chromosome. So my background is, for my PhD, I looked at the link between surnames, British surnames, and the Y chromosome. So the Y chromosome is basically a segment of our DNA that's got on it the gene, essentially kind of for maleness. So it's a gene that switches on
I'm not going to
as
say anything there.
yeah during development. Yeah. And it will sends the embryo down, you know, it starts this whole cascade of stuff, and it sends the fetus down the path to becoming a boy. So only boys have it. They get it from their dad, and then the sons will pass it down to their sons, and so on down through the generations. So I was, when I did my PhD, it was looking at surnames come down through the male line, Y chromosomes come down through the male line. So does that mean that all men alive today with a particular surname, so for example, Attenborough was one of the surnames I looked at, does that mean they're all related? And they all have the same Y chromosome because they've all descended from this original Mr. Attenborough who lived several hundred years ago. So that's what my research had been on. So I was really interested about, okay, so what about Y chromosome? What about male line relatives of Richard III? Is there a DNA match there? So again, this is where Kevin came in. It's actually really straightforward to do this. You just go to a book called Burke's Peerage.
Oh, yes.
And you can find, you know, living male line relatives. You have to go up to Richard's great granddad, through Edward III, down through John of Gaunt, down through the generations. And when I looked at these individuals, there were five of them who all descended from Henry Somerset. He's the 5th Duke of Beaufort, and they were all kind of distantly related. One of them didn't match, and it turned out they actually knew there might be an illegitimacy in the family tree. They just hadn't mentioned it to us. That was a bit of a nerve-wracking thing. But the other 4, so they matched, or enough that it tells us what Henry Somerset's Y chromosome type would have been. This is much easier with a genealogy, so maybe I'll send it to you so that you can actually put it on the screen.
Okay.
But basically, there's 19 generations between Richard III, and you go up to his great granddad, and you go up to Edward III, down through John of Gaunt, down till you get Henry Somerset, 5th Duke of Beaufort. There wasn't a match between those 4 and Richard. Now, I'm not worried about this. I know that you get, it's called a false paternity. So where the biological father is not the recorded father, that happens. About 1 to 2% per generation historically, we think.
Okay.
So I'm not surprised at all. This sort of happens, and it could have happened more than once in those 19 generations that separates Richard from Henry Somerset. But it was interesting because we did put it in the paper and said, they don't match. Now, the explanation for this is that there's been a false paternity or false paternities in this family tree, and we don't know where it is. But it's interesting, has implications for the historical monarchy in terms of maybe somebody wasn't actually a legitimate son. Interesting. We don't know where this happened. But the press went completely bananas. And because in sections of the tree are obviously, it could affect the Yorkist Plantagenet kings, it could affect the Lancastrian Plantagenet kings. and also potentially, if it was in two parts of the tree, one of two parts of the tree, the tutors. And so people are like, oh, should Queen Elizabeth be on the throne, et cetera, et cetera. And I spent huge amounts of time going, wait a minute. We don't know where this has happened. The crown doesn't pass in a straight line from Henry Tudor, so Henry Tudor is actually descended from a line that was banned from ever taking the throne, and that didn't stop him. So the crown it's not passed in a straightforward way. Yeah, and it takes lots of detours from Henry Tudor down to Queen Elizabeth, because you have cousins coming in and all sorts of stuff. So we had to kind of go back up. It doesn't affect the modern monarchy at all, not least because we don't even know where it's happened. But that was a really interesting one, because I spent about a month nearly kind of talking to press, going and from all over the world. That was the other thing. So going, it doesn't affect the Queen.
You're never getting an OBE. That's it.
I know, that's it. It's gone out the window. Even though we're going, look, back up. It doesn't affect her. It was just the press. And here's me going, wow, the science, it's taken me, a long time to do this. I've, had to design new experiments and all this kind of stuff to do all this work. I'm like, yay, science. I've worked on this for so long with this amazing team. And then the press, the main thing they were interested in is, should the Queen be on the throne? It's like, so yeah, but it's just been an amazing project. And obviously the other thing that I was able to do was hair and eye color, which was quite cool.
Well, I was going to say that there's some great sort of like personal, like looking into the face of, because you did do a facial construction, and looking into the face of history is just the most spine-tingling thing, isn't it?
It's so cool. So this is Caroline Wilkinson. So and she's amazing, and she does facial reconstruction. So one of the things that the Richard III Society did actually pay for was they had facial reconstruction done from the skull. And Caroline will tell you that, there's set things that you do. So we know about, certain muscle depth and things like that. So she'll get the skull and she'll put like little, I don't know, they're like little sort of sticks almost that she puts all over it of different kind of lengths to kind of think, well, that's going to be the muscles. And she said that, because he's king, he's probably eating a little bit better. So she'll make him a little bit chubbier in the cheeks and things like that. So she did all of that. But before I managed to do the hair and the eye color stuff, and the reason why I was interested in the hair and the eye color stuff is because there's no contemporary portraits of Richard. There's none from his lifetime. They're all about 25 to 30 years later. And the two earliest ones, and they're about the same time frame, are in the Society of Antiquaries in London, so the arched frame portrait, where he's got lighter color hair and quite light blue eyes. And then the other one that everyone seems to know about, the one that's in the National Portrait Gallery, is actually based on the one that's in the Royal Collection, which is earlier, where he's got darker color hair and much darker eyes. And I thought, well, we can do this now with DNA. We can predict somebody's hair and eye color based on their DNA. So did this, and again, working with an amazing chap I know called Manfred Kaiser, who does all of this sort of stuff. So I did all of the typing of the genetic stuff, and we put it through his database, and it came out as being sort of lighter hair color, well, certainly with age. So 77% chance of having blonde hair, but that's a childhood hair color. It can darken with age. I mean, certainly mine did. And then blue eyes, he's definitely going to have, so 96% chance of having blue eyes. So what happened was Caroline came down with a couple of L'Oreal hair colors to the Richard III Visitor Center where the facial reconstruction was. And we redid, so he got lighter color eyes, because the one it most closely matches with that kind of thing of having slightly lighter hair color and definitely the blue eyes is the the arched frame portrait from the Society of Antiquaries. Right. So that's the one it most closely matches. So Caroline came down with a couple of L'Oreal hair colors, and we went, we'll go for that one. Right. And we dyed his hair in the bit
dark.
Yeah, yeah, because she'd done it she had done it obviously based on the portraits that we know about, the ones that people so all the portraits that have been done of Richard seem to be based mainly on the one that's in the Royal Collection. So the one that you see in the National Portrait Gallery is a copy of that, and that seems to have formed the basis for all other kind of portraits of Richard. And the Society of Antiquaries one is slightly less known. So when she'd been doing it, she'd obviously done darker hair color, and his eyes were quite dark. So now we could change it based on the genetics. So he's got slightly lighter hair now, and she's given him sort of quite bright blue eyes. But it's so fun. It's so cool to be able to go, I mean, we can't be definitive. It's predictive and so on and so forth. But it's the sort of thing where you can add that extra element of information now to someone who's been dead for
Yeah.
several hundred years. Yeah.
I find it fascinating as well that you've managed to track down Michael Ibsen.
Yeah. Oh, so that was, yeah. So that wasn't us, but yeah.
Yeah, is carrying around his genes. You know,
He's carrying it well. So he's carrying inside. So the mitochondrial DNA, which is a very, very tiny percentage of our DNA, but he's carrying that little bit that matches Richard, and it's through this descent. And same with Wendy.
Yeah, yeah, and
So
and,
it's a really,
and there was that lovely link because Michael's he's a carpenter, isn't he?
yeah.
And
Oh,
I
he's
heard
such
him.
a sweetheart, and he made the coffin that Richard was buried in. Was so nice, and he's such a lovely chap. He's become a friend over the years. But yes, so he actually made the coffin that Richard was buried in. One of my most fondest sort of memories of that whole period is, you know, he was working away on this thing which is going to be seen by millions of people on television. And as part of the whole sort of set of ceremonies that happened was Richard left the university. We had a ceremony for him outside the Fielding Johnson building, the main building at the university. And his coffin was taken in a cortege, and he was taken out to Bosworth Battlefield, where he died, which is just outside of Leicester, and then brought back in. And there was a service in the cathedral. And so we all had to arrive early to wait for the coffin to arrive. And I was next to Michael. And as the coffin came in, I was very much aware that this must be such a big moment for him, because it was the one time that the world would see his handiwork. And so standing next to him whilst all this was happening, I was very I feel very protective of him because he's just such a sweetheart. So yeah, I think it was quite a big moment for all of us to kind of see that. And also because of the legal wranglings, that we'd had Richard's remains in our care for longer than he'd been king, for quite a long time. And I think we all felt that at this point, because he was only king for just over 2 years.
Right.
So we all felt that it was time to lay this
He needed to be
person
laid
to
low.
rest.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was quite it was sort of a sense of a good ending, I think, to this big project where he was being reinterred. So yeah, so it's been these lovely little connections that have kind of happened throughout the project, which has been nice.
You've got a great job.
I do. It's cool. It's stressful though, because I have to admit, the number of times, you know, when you're working with ancient remains, you
Yes.
have a finite amount of material to work with.
Yes.
And these are somebody's remains. And you are the whole time you're going, the sense of responsibility is high. I feel very, you know, this is a precious sort of sample. This is an individual. So at times it's quite stressful because you feel so responsible, I think.
Well, Turi, it's at this point in our chat that I turn to my cabinet of river curiosities, which is behind.
I love that.
Thank you very much. And I
looks so cool.
that I can talk to my guest about. But the thing that I want to talk to you about, it isn't in here. It's too big to go in here, and is in fact neatly packaged up and very respectfully kept on a shelf in my garage at the moment. And I am talking about Fred. Now, anybody who has been following the story of Fred will know, but I'll just go back through it in case anyone new is watching this. So last year I was mudlarking on the Estuary, and I came across some human remains. Now there was a skull, and there were some bones, various bones. There was a two-leg bones, part of a pelvis, the lower part of an arm, a kneecap, and some finger and toe bones, and this really rather beautiful skull. Now, when you find human remains on the foreshore, you have to report them to the police, obviously. So I was left with this sort of debate. What do I do? They were in the intertidal zone. I didn't know how far the water was going to come in, if the water was going to wash them away. So I decided the best thing to do would be to dig a very shallow pit, put everything I could find in there. I scouted around everywhere, picked up everything I could, put it in the pit, covered it up, put a stone on it, put a big branch up here, took a GPS, and let the police know. And they came out on the next tide, they dug everything up and they took it all away. Now, where I found the bones is out in the estuary, in an area where the prison hulks were moored around 200 years ago. And human remains do show up in this area simply because these prison hulks were such dreadful places. They were decommissioned warships. They lay at anchor off in the river in very inhospitable, marshy areas. The men on board and the women were either Napoleonic prisoners, or they were awaiting transportation to Australia, Tasmania. They were kept there simply because there wasn't enough room in the prisons. It was a convenient place to keep them. If they managed to escape, there was nowhere for them to go. There were marshes. If you imagine, Charles Dickens writes very well about it, Magwitch crawling through the marshes, trying to find, someone and chancing upon Pip. And it's very much like that there. It still is very marshy, very bleak, and I love it out there. It's a kind of strange, weird, sort of ugly, beautiful place. But there's a real sense of all all the history there that's happened. And so these hulks would lay at anchor. They'd take off the masts, they'd put bars on the windows and divide the inside into cells. And they were just floating hellholes. There was disease, there were very brutal places. Lots of people died. If they got disease on board, it would spread very quickly, and there was starvation. As I say, it was very brutal. People would die from being beaten up. And when people died, they'd row them to the nearest patch of marsh. They'd bury them in a shallow grave and just leave them there. And there's a famous island actually out in the Medway called Dead Man's Island. Now, I should say here that Dead Man's Island is private. It's an absolute no-go area. Nobody should, regardless of what's on the internet, nobody should be going out there. I know that people have been in trouble with the police for going out there. It's a mass grave. There are skeletons falling out onto the foreshore at the moment. And that's because there's so many people buried out there. The river levels are rising by a foot every 100 years, and it's starting to erode these graves. Now, for people to go out there looking for human remains is distasteful, absolutely distasteful. It's also a nature reserve. It's a very important nesting area, so people shouldn't be going out there. I can't emphasize that enough. We didn't find it there. We chanced upon it. It was something we chanced upon, which is why we decided to call the police. And it turns out that there is an ongoing case in the area. So it was good that we did. The police took it in, they carbon dated it, and it's been carbon dated to around 200 to 300 years. And this is when you actually contacted me. This is how we know each other, okay? Yeah. So I posted it on my Facebook page. You contacted me, explained who you were and what you did, and asked if you could be any help at all, which is incredible. And at the same time, someone called Paola Magni from Murdoch University in Perth, Australia, contacted me. Now, she is an expert in barnacle colonization on human remains, and she has an incredible team out in Australia. And she contacted me as well and said, I would love to work on these remains. I've never been able to work on anything that old, and it'd be incredible. I could learn so much from it. So I got in touch with the police, asked if this might be possible. And I've been in contact with the police and the coroner over here to work all this out. And I've had the sign off. They all said, fine, yes, that's fine. We know this isn't part of an ongoing case. It's okay for you to send these to Australia. So I am in the process of getting Fred out to Australia. Now, the last time I posted about him, he was going off down my garden path with the DHL man. And unfortunately, this was just before lockdown. He came back a couple of days later. DHL in Australia said they didn't have a problem with handling human remains. The university checked it out with them, but my local DHL office did, and so they sent him back. So Fred's back here at the moment, but I am working with you. You're very kindly helping us get Fred over to Australia. Excuse me. And we are going to get Fred out there. By hook or by crook. The poor old chap's going to go out there. Can you give us some idea of what you might be able to help us with? What you might be able to tell us about this? I assume it's a man. It might be a woman. I don't know.
And that's something that we can hopefully try and check with DNA. So the big thing with ancient remains, like I was saying, so the DNA degrades. He's also been waterlogged from the looks of it. So we'll have to have a look. The first thing first, and I had to do this with Richard as well, is there any analyzable DNA left?
Yeah.
And I will try and go for the petrous bone. So it's been known about for a while, but it was discovered sort of in the ancient DNA world in terms of its usefulness. It's been known for a long time it's the hardest bone in the body. But what we've recently found is actually, in terms of sort of the amount of kind of usable DNA per square inch type thing, that's the place to go for. So use teeth, you can use teeth, you can use, long bones, femurs, bits like that. But if you want, so highest kind of concentration of usable DNA is likely to be in here. So that's the bit you go for. And it's kind of near, so it's the ear canal. There's a very hard bone in there.
Just inside the skull, is it?
Yeah, it's inside. So we're going to have a look at him and see, because it's always, all the time what you're doing is you're trying to sort of do minimal damage to the remains, because ancient DNA work is destructive. You have to grind whatever you're looking at to a powder, the tooth, and then from that you can extract the DNA. So go for that, see if there's any analyzable DNA. And I wondered if it might be useful to help in terms of, like what we did with Caroline, can we say anything about what this individual looked like? Because I know you were thinking about doing facial reconstruction. Can we do something along those lines? Paola's team's thinking about doing it, isn't she?
She is, yes. I mean, Paola's put together a crack team of scientists and people, and I should say they're all women, which is incredible. It's a girls' team, and there is a facial reconstruction lady who is hopefully going to give us some idea of what he actually looked like. I mean, he is. There's not much of him from here down. No teeth left, but she might be able to put something. I hope that would be great.
So we thought, well, let's just see what we can do with this. Can we look at anything that will help in terms of hair and eye color? And then Sarah Hainsworth, who did all the micro CT scans for Richard, has said, she'll help out. She'll do micro CT. She'll do all the CT scans to see if we can find any evidence of any injuries, anything like that on the remains. So she's going to do that as well. And we're going to finish doing all that, and then we're going to package him up and send him off to Australia. And it might help if it comes from one university going to another university.
Yeah, rather than my house.
Yeah.
Which is a bit weird.
Getting rid of the evidence. And then Paola and her team will do their thing. And then hopefully, I really like these holistic approach things where you get sort of a team of experts all from different areas who all bring their stuff to the table, and it gives you a much wider picture. And I think that I'm hoping that that's what we'll be able to do with our Fred, if it is Fred. Might be Frederica.
But it is an incredible coming together of universities in two different countries as well, and all different disciplines. I think it's fabulous. I think it's so.
And that happens a lot these days. It's really nice, because that is one of the things about science and academic research is it's interdisciplinary. It's across institutions and things like that. It's one of the things I really enjoy about my field is I get to work with people from all over the world who do really interesting things. I feel I'm really lucky that way.
Yeah. So you found out Richard III's eye color and hair color. Yeah. Is it likely that you'll be able to find out Fred's hair
It'll
color?
depend on DNA quality completely.
Okay.
So it depends on what's left. And if it's something that's analyzable. If it is, then what I will do is I will basically, you look at lots of tiny differences that are in the DNA sequence, and from that you can use it to predict what somebody's hair and eye color is. So I'll ring up Manfred and say, can you pop this through your forensic DNA database and see what comes up with sort of the various hair and eye colors, and then hopefully go from there. So completely will depend on DNA quality. That will be the very first step.
Fabulous. Well, I mean, so we could end up with a face, we could end up with hair and eye color, we could end up finding out if he had any sort of dietal deficiencies or any diseases or trauma.
Yeah, so from the DNA point of view, again, it'll completely rely on DNA quality in terms of that kind of thing. But presumably you'll have sort of someone who'll do a skeletal analysis to look for any evidence of anything that's available to actually sort of see on the actual remains, any evidence of any disease or anything like that.
Yeah.
So hopefully that will be somebody in Paola's team.
Brilliant. So, I mean, I think he's either Napoleonic prisoner, he's French, he came from France, or he was one of the poor souls who was waiting to be transported across the oceans to Australia. So the irony that he's finally going to make this journey via DHL to Australia.
It's faster.
It's going to be faster and probably a lot more comfortable.
Yeah.
It's fabulous, and you know, I really hope we can learn something from this. It's an amazing journey. I'm enjoying it so much.
I love it.
And you know, thank you so much for coming on board with it, and I will keep everybody updated with what's going on with Fred. As I say, at the moment he's in my garage, but he's soon going to Leicester to Professor Turi King.
We're arranging that at the moment. It's all with lockdown, isn't it? It's what we can do at the moment, and then have him come up and do some analysis, and then send him off to Australia.
Well, thank you so much, Turi, for joining me, and I'll be speaking to you very soon.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye now.